Hello. So for my timeline core assessment, I chose to focus on psychology and homosexuality and how it has changed from a diagnosed mental health condition into something that is now recognized as something that is normal. So for my first timeline, I just did a little one from the 1800s to the 1900s. So during the 1800s, one psychology event that happened was the publishing of Psychopathia Sexualis in 1886 by Richard von Krafft-Ebing. He was a German psychiatrist, and in this book, he said that unconventional sexual behaviors were considered psychopathology, and this would include any sexual activity that wasn't related to procreation. So like sex for pleasure, masturbation, anything like that was an unconventional sexual behavior. Homosexuality, because it wasn't for procreation, was considered a degenerative disorder because that plays into the unconventional sexual behaviors. You cannot engage in sex with a same-sex partner in order to procreate. Part of the zeitgeist influence for the 19th century was the shift that Western culture had from religious to secular authority. So these religious terms and ideas turned into secular terms and ideas. So the same situations were seen, but they were just named differently. So, for example, demonic possession was turned into insanity to be more secular, drunkenness as alcoholism, and sodomy as homosexuality. So, you can see kind of here how religion had to play into how individuals approach these different terms, these different behaviors and situations. So, this is a really big overview of the next 100 years from the 1900s into the 2000s, but I will go through each individual point throughout the timeline. I just want to give a brief overview of what we're going to be looking at. So, in the early 1900s, there was a psychology event. Sigmund Freud in 1905 published three essays on the theory of sexuality. So, as we all know from the textbook, Sigmund Freud is the founder of psychoanalysis. And in these essays, he stated that everyone is born with bisexual tendencies, and it is then the maturation of an individual that turns them into the heterosexual beings that are normalized. So, homosexuality, from Freud's standpoint, is seen as immaturity or, I quote, arrested psychosexual development. He did not believe that it was a degenerative condition like Krafft-Ebing thought. Freud actually saw many intellectually able individuals that were also homosexual. And then near the end of his life, he wrote that, and I quote, homosexuality is assuredly no advantage, but it is nothing to be ashamed of. No vice, no degradation. It cannot be classified as an illness. We consider it to be a variation of the sexual function produced by a certain arrest of sexual development. And interestingly, after his death in 1939, everyone kind of went back to seeing homosexuality as something pathological, even though Freud did have quite a bit of influence, especially in the field of psychology. So during the 1950s, there was a really big psychology event, and that was the first DSM being published by the American Psychiatric Association, pardon me, and that was in 1952. So as you can see, I uploaded an image of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. This is the cover of the first edition. In this edition of the DSM, homosexuality was considered a sociopathic personality disturbance. So, kind of back to what Krafft-Ebing had to say about homosexuality, it's not following Freud's pattern of thought at all. And this sexual deviation included homosexuality, transvestism, pedophilia, fetishism, and sexual sadism. And then part of the zeitgeist influence in this era, in the 1950s, the American Psychiatric Association did want to categorize normal or healthy behaviors versus these abnormal or unhealthy behaviors. And because homosexuality was seen as something abnormal, not a lot of the population are going to be homosexuals. That is why they wanted to include it in this first edition of the DSM. So categorizing these behaviors, the the point of it was to find different diagnosable patterns. I'm sure their intent was to help and to kind of give individuals these labels so that they could find a treatment for these mental disorders, but it did end up creating harm in the homosexual community. So, continuing the 1950s, there were two pretty big psychology events. So, in 1953, the reports were published. So, Alfred Kinsey, he surveyed thousands of individuals that were not considered to be psychiatric patients. These are both heterosexual and homosexual individuals, but he found that homosexuality was more common than it was thought at the time. He found that it was about 10% of the population. And there was another study done by Evelyn Hooker actually in 1957, and she found the rate to be between 1 to 4% of the population. But she did a study in which she compared homosexual males to heterosexual males, and she compared their intellect and their psychological disturbances, and that she found that there were no more indicators of psychological disturbances in the homosexual males compared to the heterosexual males. And for the zeitgeist influence for this point, for the 1950s, the findings of both Kinsey and Hooker were very surprising. Homosexuality's inclusion in the DSM made it much easier for individuals to discriminate against or stigmatize these individuals because it was published by the APA that these were unhealthy, um, sort of sort of stigmatizing behaviors for individuals to have, though these studies done by Kinsey and Hooker show that there is not much of a difference between individuals that are homosexual versus those that are heterosexual, except for the sex that they prefer. And then around the 60s, there was another psychological event that happened, another psychology event, and that was aversion therapy. This is can also be known as conversion therapy, and this was widely used to cure homosexuality. So that's that conversion therapy, converting them from homosexuality to heterosexuality. So actually, the University of Birmingham used aversion therapy on many gay individuals, but there was a gay man who goes by the name of Chris, who came out to share his story in 2022, though he went through this aversion therapy in the 1970s. So, aversion therapy was kind of like this example that I included. It would be when subjects looked at a series of images and received a shock if they showed sexual deviance. So if they showed more interest in an image of the same sex that they were, then they would get this shock therapy, this aversion therapy to hopefully convert them. And this was used outside of this time period I specified, but this is the main time frame in which I wanted to include it because it is when the University of Birmingham really started to start up this conversion therapy and using this aversion therapy for homosexual individuals. Since then, they have released a statement saying that they are sorry. They provide different resources to individuals that are struggling in the LGBTQ plus community. And they have shown remorse for those actions. They have taken accountability. I was actually able to find the document online. That is in my works cited, but you should be able to find it online with a quick Google search as well. So during the 1960s, another psychology event happened, and that was the publishing of the second edition of the DSM. So, in this edition, homosexuality is still listed as a mental disorder, and it's very similar to the first DSM. There weren't any really big changes between the first one and the second one, but before the third one was to be published, there would be a change. But that comes later on in the timeline. So, into the 1970s, so part of the zeitgeist influence were the Stonewall riots. So, the first riot occurred on June 28th, 1969, though there were riots over 6 days. And for clarification's sake, these aren't the only times that police officers and homosexual individuals would get into these scuffles, but this is considered the main turning point in LGBTQ plus activism and the homophile movement. So during the Stonewall riots, it started off when police raided a gay bar in New York City. And like I said, this was a really big turning point for activism. So I found a source that said that before Stonewall, there were about 60 gay rights and activist groups, but right after, there were up to 143, which showed rapid support uprising for the gay rights movement. And into the 70s, it got even higher. The groups increased very dramatically, so there wasn't a set number for that. And the Library of Congress actually states that, and I quote, if Stonewall truly represented one shift at all, was a shift primarily for white cisgender people as for people of color, and gender nonconforming people never truly had the benefit of concealing their marginalized identities. So because of all this news coverage, a lot of white cisgender people were shown that these individuals do have to hide who they are if they do want to be accepted, which in turn led to more activism. So, continuing from that point, another part of the zeitgeist influence was in 1970 when there was the first pride marches in New York City, Los Angeles, and Chicago, and this was exactly a year from the beginning of the Stonewall riots. And this is, of course, the beginning of an annual tradition. There are still pride marches, pride parades held all over the world today. But it is an annual celebration. This was just the first time that a big group got together to really celebrate who they are. So here is a little review showing Freud's essays, the DSMs, aversion therapy, and then the Stonewall riots leading into the first Pride marches. Again, there is a lot in this 100-year period, so I just wanted to do that short review. So going on to the 1970s, there was another really big zeitgeist influence. It was called declassification. So as the gay rights movement was coming to its spearhead, there were many LGBTQ plus voices were heard at the annual APA conference. So they were telling their own stories on different panels, and the big sentence, the big phrase for the time was "gay is good." And the gay is good activists had a panel in which they would tell these stories, talk about how these stigmas affected them, how the label of a disorder meant that they needed a cure when this was just how they were born. And there was an individual, he went by Dr. Anonymous, and he was covered, I believe he had voice altering, um, something or another put on so that he wasn't recognizable because he was actually a psychologist. So the psychology event was also in 1973, and that's when the APA takes a vote on homosexuality being included in the DSM as a mental health condition. So at the annual APA convention, there were 5,854 psychiatrists that voted to remove homosexuality from the DSM, and then there were 3,810 to retain it as well. And I found that on a web resource as well. And then Dr. John Fryer was actually Dr. Anonymous. He is currently honored with an APA annual award given in his name to honor those who contribute to the mental health of sexual minority communities. So from the 70s into the 80s, there were a lot more big events that happened. Two psychology events happened. In 1974, homosexuality was removed from the DSM-2. Like I said, there was a big panel, there was voting that occurred, and they voted to take it out as a mental health condition. So in the updated version of the DSM-2, it was called a sexual orientation disturbance. So this does not only consider LGBTQ plus members, but any individuals that experience a conflict with their sexuality or desire to change it. So that encompasses a great deal of individuals. It's not specifically aimed at homosexual individuals. So the second psychology event in 1980 was when the DSM-3 was published. So the title for the disorder was ego dystonic homosexuality, and that replaced the sexual orientation disturbance. So it introduces gender identity disorder and makes homosexuality a psychosexual disorder. So seems to be regressing a little bit, but it's also encompassing gender identity disorder. So it's encompassing a larger group of the LGBTQ plus that are now included in the DSM-3. So, the 1980s, the psychology event for 1985 was that the Association of LGBTQ plus psychiatrists was formed. And these individuals support those within the psychiatric community as well as other patients or clients in the LGBTQ plus community seeking resources. So I linked this lecture from the president of the AGLP in case anybody does want to watch it later. It's about an hour long, but he just talks about the LGBTQ journey in psychiatry and then the American Psychiatric Association as well. So, here is another timeline, just getting everybody up to date. And then that last event at 1996, I will speak about on the next slide, but this is just to show the completed timeline of the 100 years to show how much has happened in just 100 years. So from the 90s, the zeitgeist influence for this period would be in 1996 when the Defense of Marriage Act was passed. So this act defined marriage as between a man and a woman, which allowed states to deny same-sex couples. However, in the 2010s, there was another zeitgeist influence moment in 2013 with the United States versus Windsor. So this reversed the ruling of the Defense of Marriage Act. It allowed same-sex couples legal marriage, but it didn't protect it. So here is what it looks like from the 2000s up to date, 2024. So we will move on to furthering on the 2010s. So another psychological event happened in 2013 when the DSM-5 was published. So this is the current edition right now. This includes a non-mental disorder of gender dysphoria, excuse me, but it doesn't include homosexuality in the pages of the DSM for this edition. It is possible that someday all LGBTQ plus experiences will be left out of the DSM as a disorder instead of as their identity. But we have made very big strides in the past, and I'm sure there are lots more changes to go as the social climate continues to influence psychology and vice versa. So another part of the zeitgeist influence was in 2015. There was a court case in which the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that marriage equality is the law of the land. So this took the overruling of the Defense of Marriage Act and made it a protection. So this protects same-sex couples in all 50 states by law. So this means that marriage equality is available for all individuals. So we're moving more towards that acceptance at this point, especially with the legality of the matters from like a mental health condition to a normalized part of life. So there are, of course, more zeitgeist influences on how individuals think about homosexual individuals. So on June 12th, 2016, there was a shooting. It was at Pulse, which is a gay nightclub in Orlando, Florida. It resulted in the death of 49 individuals and the wounding of 53. And this also took place during Pride Month. So as you can see, that prejudice, the stigma surrounding homosexual individuals, and the violence and hatred is still happening to this day. There was actually another shooting done about a year out from the Pulse shooting. It was another mass shooting targeting specifically these LGBTQ plus community members. Jumping forward a bit, in December of 2023, Pope Francis authorizes blessings of same-sex couples. He was famously told to have said, "Who am I to judge?" when asked about homosexual marriages and couples. He was also told a gay clergyman who survived sexual assault that, quote, God made you like this. God loves you like this, end quote. So this was a big turning point, especially for religious individuals, um, as religion and even secular authority have had ties in the past, as we can see from the 19th century. But we are moving forward with this. Unfortunately, politics and religion will likely always be intertwined, but it is taking a step in a positive direction in which the Pope is even showing this acceptance of individuals. Um, and he does support the legality of same-sex marriages, all same-sex matters as well. So, as a big review for the Timeline Project, talking about psychology and homosexuality, it can be seen that we have made drastic changes in the community. We've come a long way from defining homosexuality as a sociopathic personality disturbance to LGBTQ plus communities being psychologically, legally, and socially accepted. One could argue that there is more work to be done, especially since the stigma and prejudice surrounding and then also the violence directed towards LGBTQ plus communities continues, but psychology has been a huge factor in pushing towards the acceptance of sexual minority groups, though the zeitgeist has influenced it greatly as well. And it just goes to show that these um, psychology events aren't the only factors in understanding the history of psychology, but the zeitgeist and the spirit of the times, any other social events also has a really great influence on how individuals perceive, understand, and explore these different phenomena that shows up in our regular lives. All right, and as that is the end of my presentation, here is my works cited page. I really enjoyed doing this research project. It further helped me understand that there is a big factor in the zeitgeist and the psychology happenings of the times and how they work together to sort of push forward into history. And it's really hard to understand one without also having an understanding of the other. But thank you.